thanks a lot. It's great to be here. It's fun to talk to all kinds of different audiences, and I tend to get excited about what I'm talking about and occasionally speed up, so feel free to wave at me if it starts going really fast. And if you have questions, I'm totally happy to stop, although there will also be time for questions at the end. And I do have an order, so I reserve the right to say I'm going to get to that, but there are plenty of things I probably haven't thought of that you want to ask me, so I'll be open to that as well. So a little bit of background. I started my PhD program about 8 years ago, although I've actually been working on this for a bit longer. And I had been DJing for about 8 years further before that, playing a lot of Jamaican music, among other things, which is part of, if you read the description for this talk, one of the case studies for the issues I'm talking about has to do with Jamaican music. And I started out my own research not thinking about technology in itself at all, but thinking a lot about copyright law and ideas about ownership. And that's partly because if you work with and are engaged with Jamaican music, you realize that the ways people think about their relationship to music is much more complicated and doesn't really fit in a lot with ideas of ownership that are familiar to the legal world. And I'll give you some examples of that later, but just as a setup, I'll say that. And being at a law school surrounded by people who do policy, because I was in a policy program, you hear a lot about people talking in relation to music and music industries. You hear people talking about how copyright is necessary for a productive industry. It's necessary to incentivize people to create. And what I knew of Jamaican music was that Jamaica had never enforced copyright law on the island for most of its existence, and yet it was one of the most productive and creative places I could think of musically. So already I came in with this this is a little, there seems to be more to the story here, and that's part of what I wanted to investigate. And once I went further with that, I found these conflicting narratives. I looked both historically and also ethnographically. So I looked at the history of Jamaican music, and I went and lived in Jamaica for a year and tried to get to know how people were dealing with music in all kinds of ways. And these conflicting narratives were, from the legal and business world, the way they talk about music in Jamaica is basically in terms of failure and lack. They talk about how there's no enforcement, how it's a free-for-all, it's the Wild West, and how people are unprofessional, undisciplined, they don't follow rules, they don't sign contracts. A lot of this is what's not there. It doesn't look like what they think it should look like. And then from my own experience, again, in the music world, I saw a lot of sort of a different kind of story, right, about vastly creative people also doing very complicated and sophisticated things with music and with each other in ways that didn't seem to me particularly undisciplined. They were just lined up on a different kind of discipline than what perhaps these other folks were talking about. And in terms of productivity, according to official numbers, which are undoubtedly low, from the 1950s to about 2000, Jamaica produced over 100,000 recordings, and this is off an island of 2.5 million people. So some people estimate it's one record per year for every 1,000 people. It's hard to know. Again, also because most of this stuff was untracked, and likely it's a lot higher. The number of recordings and the number of songs circulating around recordings is really high. Yes?
Are those mostly consumed domestically, or those international tracks?
Both. And it's also hard to count those numbers because they don't circulate on official networks, so people were always carrying records because it's a diaspora community. So Jamaicans circulate, especially throughout England, Canada, and the U.S. England, Canada is former colonizers, or England's former colonizer. Right? People travel a lot, and they carried the records with them, and they carried the records to their immigrant communities everywhere, and most of that was not on the radar, right? And that's an important question that we'll come back to. But so again, official numbers likely very low. Some official numbers estimate that in the late 90s or mid 90s, I think right before the internet era, Jamaican music was 3% of global music production, which again, under 3 million people on the island. Probably another 2 million people off the island. Actually, maybe more now. I think actually that might have switched so that there's now more Jamaicans living off the island than on because of this circulation. But anyway, vastly productive. So in terms of this incentive argument about copyright, clearly that's not very helpful. People are not under-incentivized to make music, whatever else is going on there. And both sides also agree that the music in Jamaica is centered on the urban poor. And what I mean by centered on is both that the content of the music reflects the experiences and the practices and the accents, especially of the poor in Jamaica, which are the vast majority. This is a country with drastic income inequality, and the vast majority of people don't have very much money at all, and then there's a few people who have quite a bit. There is a middle class, but even that distinction between middle class and the poor is quite high, is quite great, and it's very small. So again, the content centered on the urban poor, but also the actual people. So the people who, the performers for the most part, the way that they sing in patois, which is sort of like it's a language that is in some ways related to English, but it's very hard to follow if you don't know it already. And that language is associated also with the poor. And not a language that is welcome, for example, if you are looking for a formal job or you're going to work in government and go for a job interview, or represent people on national television. You don't speak patois. Yes?
Do they speak English then?
Yes. As far as I can tell, most people speak both, but at home, most people who are in the poor community speak patois. And again, there is a relationship, and it's partly like an accent that happens to English, but there's also different grammar and a bunch of other things. There's really interesting political debates around that. But anyway, so the music is centered on the urban poor, both in terms of content and in terms of production, and also the location of most of the major recording studios and other places which are central to the music industry. And so one thing that I started thinking about when reframing this issue for this talk was thinking about it in terms of how does the fact that Jamaican popular music is centered on the poor relate to these issues of inclusion and exclusion. Because right now when people think about economic development, a lot of folks say it's really great that this music is related to poor people and that poor people make this music. What we need to do is take it and put it in a sort of better off context. So these people don't own copyrights, they don't sign contracts, they don't behave in ways that we recognize as appropriate business behavior. If we can just get them to do all of that, thinking of the music as something you can sort of separate and make that happen with, then we're going to have a great industry. And my inkling, and it came out especially of living there, was you can't actually separate the music from the context that created it in that way. And you can't separate the culture from the context. So you can't just say, here's the music, and we're going to put the music in this formalized context and have it work. And I'll demonstrate what I mean by that through this next example. So one thing I learned, this is an image from a street dance in Jamaica. One thing I learned is that this is one of the really great examples of poor urban cultural experiences and basically the center of, or one of the centers of the music industry and the music, not even industry, the musical culture. When you get there, everyone's talking about these events. They're talked about on the radio and on the news. They're talked about socially. People talk about them on Facebook. They talk about them on Twitter now, all sorts of places. Not always in the same tones, but they're on the radar. And they set the tone for what is hot, what is important sort of culturally within Jamaica. So even elite people who criticize street dances as sites where people are behaving in a way that they think is inappropriate, they're still talking about them. They're still having to refer to them. And I thought I'd give you an image of one that I went to. And what you can't see is, you can see the size of the crowd, but what you can't see is the points at which the crowd responds to the music by going into these massive synchronized dance routines that filter all the way back through the crowd in really interesting ways. Yeah, you can't. I don't know why it's not working. There's people videotaping.
I know, we checked it.
We watched it to make sure it would work. So you can see the scale of the crowd. You can see something about what the crowd looks like. So I'm just trying to get to... There are visitors, there's folks in Japan who are coming to see this scene. Dance hall is very popular. Alright, I'm not going to annoy you, but I was trying to get to that great. I hope the other video works. So it's outdoors, it's at night, and it's a place where people dance, and the audience is an incredibly important part of the experience. So dancing is a force in the industry, and it shapes the music, dancing and audience response. So producers test their music here. When you make a song, how you know if it's going to be hot is you get a DJ to play it in this environment, and if the crowd doesn't like it, you might not ever release it again. You might do something, you might change it, and then take it back out there again. So it's part of the creative process of music making. The audience input is integrated into the way music is made. To the point that the recording really, and I think this is true everywhere, but it's especially obvious in Jamaica, the recording is really only an element in what you might call music. The live social engagement with recordings is actually what musicking is. What music is an action. Actually, it's a social action. And if you just look at the recording and you don't understand where it's happening, then you might be missing part of the significance of this music. And as well as dance, fashion, and all kinds of social performances are sort of played out in this space. The audience has a lot of authority, and they're not a homogenous group, but especially nowadays where you have foreigners coming through, like me and like the Japanese folks that you saw, who are coming to these dances to see what's happening at them and to enjoy the music. But the music and the people tell you a lot. Again, let's see if we can get this one to work. So you can see how far back that goes. That there's a whole crowd here and certain people are sort of jumping up and engaging with the music. And this is something that can only happen in this kind of outdoor space that's unregulated and that's not under the close scrutiny of formal society. There are no actual large music venues in the city of Kingston, which is insane considering how much music there is. But there's no dedicated music venues. When people have large concerts, they have them in cricket stadiums or theaters occasionally, but there isn't actually like a music hall. There are nightclubs, and some of this happens in nightclubs, but a lot of the sort of extremes of performance experimentation that happens here and the speed through which new tunes circulate has to happen in this slightly less formally regulated environment where everything is through social connections. The way things appear is through people knowing each other. So you don't like submit a formal application to be a part of any of this. People have to know each other, right? It's sort of maintained in this social way. And this really matters because this sort of is rooted in the history of social exclusion. Right, so alongside the lack of a venue, just to summarize it here, right, official radio and TV for the first, well, quite a few years, 30 or 40 years of their existence in Jamaica since the before independence in 1962, didn't play local music at all. And once they started playing local music, they didn't ever play music that was associated with the urban poor. So whatever music was popular among the majority did not actually get played on the radio. It did not get played in official venues. It wasn't on TV. And in general, there wasn't support from elites or from the state for poor people's culture in a direct way. Hotels, for example, the tourism industry avoids locally popular music, and this is pretty much true to this day. And again, patois, the language, the styles, all of this stuff is sort of seen as unprofessional in the formal environment. So this is the history of these constraints and this exclusion. And this is a relic or an extension of the colonial history of Jamaica, in which British culture was seen as the ideal to which people should aspire. So what was played on the radio was light entertainment music from England, and then later some jazz and some US music. But in general, aspiring to culture which is associated with the formal colonial culture is still seen to a great extent as the way to be respectable. What's interesting is that is exactly the opposite of what it takes to be successful within these street dances. And so the question of how to be included in any of these formal spaces while retaining those values of the street dances was one of the things that I started to think of as the paradox for people who talk about inclusion. So again, there's no other space that this can happen. It has to happen outside. This is Paso Paso, which is one of the biggest and most famous street dances. And it happens outside of Coronation Market, which is a fruit and vegetable market, which is, I believe, on the right over here. And everyone just shows up. It's free. You don't charge entry. And it's in a poor neighborhood, so it doesn't mean there's no barriers to entry, because you have to feel comfortable going there. Right? So again, the authority of the people in the neighborhood is what shapes who's there to some extent, because it's not that you can't go there if you're not from there, but they're sort of setting the tone for what's going to happen. And if you walk around, this is in Waterhouse, which is also where King Tubby's studio is, a very famous dub producer. Or wait, is it King Jammy's shoot, I've forgotten, one of the kings. But Waterhouse is also, this is a nice, maybe a more fixed up section, but Waterhouse is also a pretty poor neighborhood. And in the daytime in these neighborhoods, you'll just see these towers. This is a tower of speakers covered by a tarp. And it's just sitting there waiting for the street dance, which is going to happen that night. And you can't do this in upper class neighborhoods. You can't take up space in this way. You can't violate noise in this way, right? It's only in certain neighborhoods that allow it to happen. So street dance becomes the center of cultural affirmation for especially the urban poor in the face of this colonial exclusion. And it's also a center of musical innovation. So one of the other ways it's excluded is Jamaican music and the street dance are excluded from copyright law's protection, mostly because it was just never enforced. Law on the books in Jamaica for copyright was the same as the UK law until 1994. They just left the same law on the books. And if you remember, the UK was a colonizer. So having the colonizer's law on the books in relation to a local music scene, there isn't really a reason to assume that law is going to be in your best interest, right? Because the colonizer's interest is not, by definition, your interest as a person in this country, right? So you can already see, even before you know what the law is, that there might be a good reason to sort of not be dealing with this law very much, right? Because the existence of the British in Jamaica was to extract resources from the locals and take them back to England, right? So just, even again, before you get to the content of the law, you already can see there's a reason that this is maybe not going to be designed in the interests of the poor, because it wasn't. But also, I would say the form of the law itself and what it focuses on is not very compatible with the kinds of practices that people were doing. So there's cultural assumptions in copyright law. I don't know, how many people have heard critiques of copyright law before in relation to music? Just a couple? A few. Okay, some. I mean, there's a big debate now, right, around this. And part of what interested me about Jamaica is a lot of the things that people talk about in relation to remix culture and mashup culture and configurable culture and digital culture are things Jamaicans have been doing since the 1930s, so way before the digital era, right? But a lot of those practices and a lot of those values have been expressed and enacted here in ways that aren't dependent on technology, which again is why for me technology was not the beginning of the story, although it does come in at the end. So copyright has these cultural assumptions, and some of them are that you have discrete, identifiable individual authors who are different from consumers. So production and consumption are considered to be things that are separable. There's a focus on originality, and there's a focus on works, things that are produced where you know the beginning and the end of them, right? You can say this is a thing, it has been made, and we can identify it, we can own it as a thing. Many aspects of Jamaican music operate under completely different assumptions. I'm just going to give one example, and this is the tradition that Wayne Marshall and Peter Manuel call the rhythm method, very cutely. Has anyone here heard the word rhythm before? Anyone? Rhythm? Okay, so for those of you who haven't, it's basically the instrumental part of a song. Often it's the bass and drums, but it can be more than that as well. It's the song when you take the vocals away. And in Jamaica, people separated the rhythm from the recordings at least as early as around 1960. What happens is that different vocalists will record their own vocal lines over the same backing track. And this was facilitated by records that were pressed with only the rhythm on the B-side, which is what this is here, which meant that when you bought a record, you had the instrumental like a sort of karaoke version for your own use. So encoded into the materiality of recordings was the idea that it was actually a piece in a larger musical performance, right? You're getting the piece. It's sort of like now people release the stems of a song so that you can mess with them and you can remix it yourself, right? So this was happening on vinyl. This is a very famous rhythm. First recorded in 1974, a band led by Ansel Collins, produced by Winston Riley. Sorry, it's so blurry. It's called Stalag 17. And here is maybe one that you might recognize better. So that is Sister Nancy, who sang in 1982 a song called Bam Bam. And then just as an example from 10 years later, this is Buju Banton singing in 1992. So about 20 years of music covered here, 74, 84, 94. but it's multiple artists on the same rhythm. In fact, this website has cataloged 279 songs on the Stalag rhythm. So, and it's not unique. It's perhaps one of the more popular ones. And you can see from 1975, 2008, right? There's a lot of repetition here, of reuse, right? And this is something that you do as part of the music scene, and it's not connected to anything like asking permission for reuse. Okay, so it's part of the tradition. When you hear a rhythm, you go, oh, if you're an artist, you go, oh, I'd like to jump on that. I'd like to do my version on this. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, so the original rhythm, you said, so the producer was Winston Riley, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's clearly involved in like a whole bunch of these.
Yes. So a bunch of the ones that came out on Technique's record label, he was the house producer for Technique. So he recorded a bunch on that rhythm. But then lots of other people did too. And again, when you have tons of those B-sides floating around, you had all these records floating around, it's not like you needed to go to him to get your own version of it. Anybody who had a record.
But to me, it's interesting that it's not like, okay, I'm done with this. And
oh yeah, no, you would do it yourself
yeah.
too. Yeah, you would. He probably recorded, maybe 60 of the people on the rhythm. Yes.
Where did that tradition come from? Like, who said, I'm going to print the rhythm on the B-side?
Well, it's funny. It's actually, there's a mythology, like an origin story, which is that somebody accidentally, so first there wasn't separate track recording, right? So what happened is they would have a band in the studio and they would record the song onto vinyl right there, one track, everybody playing into a microphone. After that, they developed, or could afford, 2-track recording, and you would record the vocals separate from the band, with the whole band together. So they each had a channel, and that would be on the recording. So there's an origin story that, I think it's Cox and God, accidentally pressed a B-side with just the instrumental and no vocals. And then when somebody played it in the club, everybody loved it, and then the sort of MC of the night was like riffing on top of it. So that's the story. It makes Cox and God look really good. It's a great story. You know what I mean? Who knows, right? It's hard to know how that is there. But it's important. I think it's interesting to sort of recognize that music was always a sort of social experience. Like when people didn't, because record players were really expensive, people didn't have them in their homes. So you would have a radio, or somebody often at like a liquor store or some kind of venue where they wanted to attract people would have a record player and a speaker, and everybody would come and listen. So the sort of idea was that these were kind of social spaces where people were engaging, like music was something that you engaged in groups. And the radio too was like this for a long time. So it wasn't like everyone went back. It's not like in the image of the 50s in the US where everyone got their little 7 inches in their little cases and went home and listened to them. Like, occasionally you had your friends over and listened to them in your bedroom or whatever. But like, people were in the yard, everyone got gathered around, right? And so the sort of interactivity was sort of part of that tradition. But I don't know, it's hard to say, from that instrumental what happened. But clearly also what happened, right, is if you remember what I talked about, one of the other assumptions of copyright is originality, right? You can see a way in which a mindset of an artist might be, I'm not going to sing on someone else's backing track. I'm going to have my own backing track. Like, why would I do that? Why would I jump on something which someone else has already done? But that doesn't seem to have been a factor very much. Instead, the idea was, what can I do with that? Like, that's a piece of the music, a building block, and I'm going to do my own thing with it. Like, it's not that it wasn't creative, but the parameters for what being original meant are different than perhaps other places would assume. So, for example, in the U.S., the copyright law defaults to the idea that a rhythm or an instrumental is a whole piece that you're going to need permission from an author to get access to. And the idea is that you don't have any right to it because we want to incentivize you to go make your own song. Yes?
Do you think that laxness was sort of inherent in the culture? Like, oh, I'm going to rip off your thing, and you're going to rip off my thing. And that makes it sort of inherently hard to put this copyright system into place? Or?
I mean, I would say the idea that it's lax or that it's ripping off, right, that's a set of assumptions about what is appropriate behavior, right? So I mean, I want to catch that because that's the language that the law uses, right?
Yeah, right.
But yeah, I would say if you don't have a system that tells you how ownership is going to be, wherever that system comes from, this is what people had. So they weren't enforcing copyright law, and this is what people did instead. Where it came from, I mean, it's hard to say. Certainly lots of cultures in the U.S. also do this and have always done this. I mean, if you look at Appalachian music, you know, it's not like you go, oh, I'm going to write my own traditional Appalachian song and everyone's going to know my name as a composer. You don't do that. You go, I'm going to learn the greats and play the greats with everybody else so that we can be part of this great tradition, right? So there's lots of places. You know, it used to be in Irish traditional music, the height of success was when you composed a song and you heard someone else play it and they didn't credit you and they just said, oh, this is a little tune from County Clare. And if you had written that song, you were like, yes, because you become absorbed, you know what I mean? So you don't go, oh, they're ripping me off, or oh, I'm gonna allow him to rip me off because the benefit to me is this. Like, that, it wasn't part of the calculation. But you're absolutely right, like the fact that there was no copyright, wherever that lack came from, is I think part of why it's so hard now. There's a long tradition of people thinking about music completely differently. So, just to catch up, right, these are some of the ways in which I think the local practices contradicted copyright. And just to highlight, right, references meaning people reuse pieces of songs and reuse other songs in order to have you make the mental reference to another song. So when you hear a song, you hear the other pieces in it. Now that you've heard the Stalag rhythm, you can go out today and you can listen to Jamaican music and you will hear the Stalag rhythm again. This Is Why I'm Hot, there's a remix, a Jamaican remix of This Is Why I'm Hot that I sometimes play in my lectures. I think I maybe did at South by. In which all of a sudden in the middle, the Stalag rhythm gets dropped in just for a second. And you're supposed to go, oh, right, you hear it and you make that connection, right? So that's very different from the idea that every work is a fixed, bounded object that circulates as a whole, right? Everything can be taken apart and thrown into other things. And in general, the value of music is partly through the fact that it's circulating, rather than that you hold it back and charge a price for one-time use, right? Your fame, your reputation, your skills are all enhanced as an artist the more your stuff circulates, right? People weren't paid based on access to recordings. They weren't paid through sales, because what happened was you got paid for live performance as a vocalist, or you got paid for studio time if you were an instrumentalist. So nobody was invested in the recordings being a commodity in that way. I just want to highlight one other, I think these are good technical outlines of what's happening. I want to highlight one other aspect of it, which is that the fact that this was all happening among the poor also really matters. Partly because these scenes were part of creating an alternative vision of Jamaicanness that ended up having an enormous amount of cultural authority. But it was based on anti-colonial sort of attitudes and practices. And the question is whether the practices in copyright law are colonial in themselves, right? Is there something, they come from a colonial overlord, right? They come from the British in that case. So is there something about them that is going to specifically be harmful to marginalized people? That's something I started to wonder. Interestingly, because the music scene is also all this source of innovation, I started reading a lot about how conditions for innovation work, and I don't know if anyone's taken classes on this, but there's a lot of studies that talk about how you need to have flexibility of access and sort of openness of access and your ability to do different things with works in order to develop your creative sense, in order to create new things. And also, to maintain a shared culture among people, it requires that you circulate the same thing so that you know you're part of the same culture together. So now I've sort of incorporated you guys minorly into Jamaican culture because you know the Stalag rhythm, which is super important. And you will see, now if you're ever anywhere where people are playing Jamaican music and there are Jamaicans, you will see people respond to the Stalag rhythm, and you will know why that is, right? Which gives you a connection in. You know, it doesn't mean that you're Jamaican now necessarily, but it gives you a connection in to what that kind of culture is about. And if you're Jamaican and you know it, you grew up with it, you grew up with the song, when you hear it, you're like, that's my thing. And so, for example, when it was dropped into This Is Why I'm Hot, the Mims tune in 2009, it was a statement of sort of putting Jamaicanness into this American pop tune. So people got kind of like a rush out of it, right? So just to say, this shared culture thing is also important. So now we get to the technical part, the technology part, which is basically one of the other things that poor Jamaicans don't have is access to a lot of, globally networked technology. They have more than a lot of places. In fact, people have a lot of cell phones, for example. But they don't have a lot of access to broadband. They don't have a lot of access to computers as a whole. Those tend to be gravitating towards institutions, so maybe schools will have them or businesses will have them, and middle-class families you have them. But among the poor, it's just not secure enough. You still don't really have regular electricity, even in the city a lot of the time. So there's a lot of things that make it difficult. And this digital divide, as elsewhere, maps a socioeconomic divide, right? Again, the reasons people don't have it are partly because, partly filtering out along class and racial lines. Again, upper class neighborhoods more likely to have electricity, more likely to have more security, or I should say steady electricity, although not always. More likely to have more security, to have expensive equipment sitting around all the time. Right? These things actually matter for having access to the internet, to these global networks of communication and circulation. So can we just bring people into this? Can we just bring folks into this? Is it going to help them automatically? One of the reasons I think not is because of copyright being embedded in a lot of these technologies. So just a few very quick examples that may be familiar to you. Studio One is a new audio production site, software that you can buy, but that integrates with SoundCloud and wants to integrate with Facebook as well. And what that means is that when you produce songs, if you want to promote them on SoundCloud, SoundCloud has copyright enforcement software on it. So if you make a song in which you reuse a rhythm, or you reuse something from an American pop tune, or something which is in SoundCloud's database, you're not going to be able to circulate that. So it's not that you can't still do the creative practices that you want, but your access to these networks is going to be filtered out based on how well you conform to what they want you to do, right? So it's about shaping who can take advantage of these. It becomes a tiered system. This is a very weird, I was hoping it would expand better. This is an illustration of Audible Magic, which is the software that SoundCloud and YouTube uses to test, to catch people who they think are violating copyright. So it compares the waveform of audio. And also on YouTube it only compares audio. And on SoundCloud it's comparing the audio waveform. And it basically compares the waveform that you upload to a database, and if it thinks that you're violating copyright, it has a choice of things to do, from blocking it, to sending you a threatening letter, to reporting it to the copyright owner that it has identified. So again, this just means to the extent that your practices violate copyright, you may not be able to take advantage of these new devices. So inviting people to take part in them means requiring people change their cultural practices. And for me, I want to know what's the payoff in changing the cultural practices when they have so many other things that are valuable and they're very productive and they're good for the community, for example. If you're going to invite people to change their cultural practices, you better know what it is they're trading, I would say. It's not just a plus. And then the other thing this is somebody's illustration of the Sony rootkit debacle, which is just to say that technology companies have not been shy about trying to embed copyright enforcement software onto hardware, whether you want it to or not. So I don't know if people remember this, but Sony for a while had this software that they put on their music CDs so that when you loaded it into your computer without your consent, it downloaded monitoring software onto your computer at the root level, which would report back to Sony what you were doing. And it was a huge security violation in all kinds of ways, and it was over copyright enforcement. So I don't think it's too extreme to say this is something we should be worried about, is that this stuff is being embedded in all of our technology without us knowing it. And that it's going to have, I think, a differential effect on communities and cultures that rely on these other practices that don't fit with the law. So the other argument, of course, is why can't they just own more copyrights? This is a very long and complicated debate. This is where most lawyers sort out. They say we need to educate people, we need to get them to claim their rights, we need to get people to be more professional, we need to have more lawyers there in Jamaica. But they don't have very many entertainment lawyers. But of course lawyers, we want there to be more lawyers. Right? So, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about this, but I would say people have a really good reason to be suspicious of the law and of lawyers in Jamaica. They have a long history of it. So overcoming that is going to be, I think, a process that has to start somewhere else than just telling people that they ought to trust lawyers this time, because there's a long history, for example, of lawyers serving either foreign music interests or very powerful local actors to the detriment of the poor. And that's the other thing I would say, is that all of the functions of copyright ownership are based in ownership being a negotiation among parties, and the powerful member in that party is always going to win that negotiation. So you have a lot of people who go into creative practices. In general, in Jamaica, the studios have ended up owning copyrights. That hasn't necessarily turned out as well for the rest of the communities, the rest of the people involved in the music scene. And there's nothing inherent in copyright that connects to equality. It connects to ownership, but ownership doesn't necessarily mean equality, right? So if what we're worried about is solving the inequality problem, copyright doesn't really in itself get you very far. So my point is that not that these things are bad, but that the terms on which you become included are more important than whether or not you say you're included. Do you have another question?
I was just wondering whether you think that it's really possible to institute the copyright system given that there are all these cultural...
It's a good question as well. I mean, the problem is that, so Jamaica had to rewrite its copyright law when it joined the World Trade Organization, and it had to promise to enforce its laws on pain of trade sanctions. So that means that if copyright industries are unhappy, copyright owners, massive copyright owners outside Jamaica are unhappy with what's happening, they can, through the WTO, pursue punishment, for example, that has nothing to do with music. They could hold back, whatever they want, medicines or other trade. They can horse trade over this stuff, right? So there's these. So on the legal side, you have these kind of machinations going on, and then on the technological side, you have the other problem, right? Which is if people are designing technology without thinking about this legal context or with assuming it, then Jamaicans' ability to make use of that technology is still unequal, right? So it may not be that everyone is going to be kept out of these systems or suffer from it, but it's going to be unequal again, and why participate in that inequality when you could maybe think about
Do you feel like perpetuating the system would make things less equal?
Well, it's more like if you're what are your choices if you're going to engage in it? Do you want to be engaged in it on the side of perpetuating inequality, or do you have other interests, right? I mean, that's basic. It is partly a personal or an ethical question, but it's also if you're interested in things like development of further inequality, like we've seen a lot of that, and I'm not sure at this point that's enough for a lot of people. So that would be one thing I would say on that. I'm going to skip this because I think we've hit it, right? There's some good sides. There's some bad sides. I have to show my fun octopus picture. Right. A bad side of network technology, right, is who's able to control the networks, who's watching on those networks, right? All of this networking is also surveillance, potentially. That's actually an image of Standard Oil from the 1900s, but it's a similar concern. I actually have a great image of the spider of the railroads and the telegraphs too, which I was thinking of using. I saw another hand over here. Did you have a question?
Yeah. So you made a pretty clear case that maybe copyright law in Jamaica isn't working terribly well. How about in the U.S.? I don't think it necessarily works out perfectly here either. Like, where do you see that going, or where do you hope that will go?
My connection with that, and I'm just going to give another example. I feel like I've already convinced you, so I don't even need it. But it's a very cool example, so I'm going to show it to you. I'll come back to that. But my way into that is partly to the extent that these things are true for Jamaica, that certain communities rely on these practices, and it seems to give them a kind of strength that is not dependent, for example, on colonial power in the same way. I would want to look and see if that's what I think is happening. And it may not be the only thing that's happening, but I think you could make that argument within the U.S. too, that certain communities, that certain cultural practices, in a lot of ways, rely on on similar kinds of tactics for survival, similar kinds of practices for survival and for flourishing. The next argument has to do with, if we're not only talking about minorities or the excluded or the exploited, there's also an argument to be made that these are sites of innovation. And I think that's also a valuable argument, although I try to hold both in my mind because a lot of people are like, rah, innovation, and don't think about inequality anymore. But I think the fact that Jamaicans have predated the digital era with a lot of their practices means for people who are looking at how things might go in the digital era, we might do well to look at what things have worked. From my perspective, the things that haven't worked don't really have to do with copyright. They have to do with a larger issue about inequality, culture, but also a larger issue about inequality. Like, Jamaica is a poor country, and I don't think it's because of copyright, and I don't think that anything copyright does is actually going to change that larger issue, which is that there's some massive power imbalances there. And the power imbalances go beyond who's the copyright owner. So for me, and I kind of feel that way in the U.S. too. Like, people talk about artist survival, and I'm like, well, free healthcare would probably do a lot more for artists than any rewriting of copyright law that we can think of, right? Like forgiving of student loans and free healthcare, right? I mean, so it's a similar issue, right? Some of these issues about survival and creativity, I think, need to be separated because the survival argument, to me, is a much bigger question. The creativity argument is a more focused one. I want to change gears just for a second for the last few minutes. I might run 5 minutes longer than I wanted. because this is a great example from somewhere very different. We're going to go now to Australia, and this is based on the work of Kim Kristen, who is awesome, and her work is fascinating. And for those of you who are interested in things like database design, this is what she's all about, and it's super cool. So this work is about the Warramungu community, which is in Tennant Creek and Alice Springs in northern Australia. And basically what happened is the Warramungu people wanted to create a archive and living archive of their cultural works. And they actually contacted Microsoft and said, we want to design this, but we want to make sure it's designed in a way that it's appropriate to what we need to use it for. And they were right to be concerned because a lot of the default assumptions about what's valuable about databases are based in different ideas than how people think about culture, say, in this particular community. So what they came up with is something called the Mukutu Purani Kari. Mukutu means dilly bag, and I'm going to read you a quote from Warramungu Man about what a dilly bag is. This is an image of some dilly bags from Australia. So he says, the way that Warramungu people use it, they used to have them old dilly bags. In them early days, old people keep their stuff in that bag, and no one was allowed to open it up or even to look at it. In these times, if people do that, they were cursed. Long, long time ago. Now we have this archive, it's good, and every archive you go to, there's a lot of stuff that's in a safe place in South Australia, Queensland. But this archive will be different. It will be here. It will be the safe place for a man like me. I can't see women's stories, or even if she's my daughter or niece, I'm not allowed to see. So it won't open up for me because we have different passwords. It's very important to make it safe. So what he's talking about here, first of all, right, is the idea that culture and information are different things, right? He's talking about an archive of culture in which culture is something that's living and embedded in social relationships. It's not a set of works or a set of stories or a set of objects which can be separated from the people and moved around independently of them. Like that you can just set access to the thing. It's actually, how does the thing relate to all the people? Who's in the story? Who's in the picture? Who's being represented? How do all those people relate to whoever it is that wants to see it? It's all completely relational. And the argument that Kim Kristen and that these Warramungu people make is that the concept of information itself as a category reflects certain cultural assumptions. And I think this is something that now gets discussed a bit more. Information versus knowledge, maybe, I think, is something that gets discussed in some. I took a class with Paul Duguid and I forget the other guy's name now at Berkeley, but they talked a lot about these distinctions, and it was pretty interesting. So what he's concerned about, anyway, is this idea about safety and about authority for who's going to have access to these cultural works. And it made me think of two different things, both of DJs and crate diggers, people who love records, and where the value in the record is partly the story you tell about where you find it. So you don't just say this record, like it's not the same to find a record in Target or in Tower as it is to go to some faraway obscure place in a basement somewhere where you pay $3 from some guy who didn't know how amazing this record was, and you blow all the dust off and listen to it, and you're like, oh my god, no one's heard this record in ages, and it's the best record ever. That's not actually separate from the record, right? That is part of what makes it valuable. And also DJs and crate diggers are really important parts of music communities as sort of authorities on what's valuable within those communities. And I was thinking also in terms of DNA and medical information, in the sense that when you learn about somebody's genetic tendencies, right, you're also learning about their family's tendencies. So if you find out that someone, for example, has a hereditary disease and they have a sibling, they can't be the only owner of that information, right? Because that information, that DNA is also in their sibling. It's also in other people. So there's ways in which that information cannot be separable from the people. So just to go back to the Warramungu, rights to cultural work also depends on relationships. They're not static. They're dynamic rights also. If somebody dies, their work changes. You can't see their work, some of their work anymore. You can't see some of their representation anymore. So this means that the database has to be embedded in social relations. This is something that might be seen as a weakness from one version of database design. You want something that's self-maintaining, right? But if the database was self-maintaining, it would be dead, right? Because you wouldn't have to connect it to the people whose culture it was. So from the Warramungu perspective, it needs to require constant input and interaction from people in order to actually be meaningful culture for them. And also this idea of rights to access are not really what people are concerned about as much as their obligations to each other to maintain the relationship. So these sort of contradict, again, a lot of the assumptions about information and knowledge that a lot of folks, I think, internalize when they're designing. So I'll just jump because we're getting close to the end. These are the kinds of questions that you have to fill out if you're joining the database. Skin name is a kind of family name, right? You have to know these different things. You have to know status levels. But even then, once you put your own information in, you're not the final arbiter of access, because someone else also gets to decide what you can see of theirs. And again, it becomes this sort of relational dance between the obligations to maintain the culture of all these different people. So just to emphasize, it's not just that you're designing protocols for a client or an owner, it's a completely different philosophy of information and concept of ownership. And again, I think you can see again that the idea of inclusion into the sort of digital era for Warmungu people is not as simple as just like, let's get all their stuff in the database and have it be preserved. Right? The terms of inclusion become important, because if you ignore those social relationships, you actually destroy the living function of their cultural practices, right? Because that's how they understand themselves to be Warmungu, is in their social relations. So if you decide that someone wants the freedom to access any information they want, you've actually just destroyed their ability to be part of the Warmungu community, because you're not supposed to have access to certain things, or other people can't have access to some of the things that you can see. I think I will stop there, just to say Julie Cohen, who's a really interesting scholar on technology and intellectual property, says that it's possible that technology can re-educate us to perceive constraint and standardization as natural attributes of the information environment, if indeed we pause to think about them at all. And this is just another argument around, like, do artifacts have politics, right? Which is just that when you design things, especially well, people stop thinking about whether they had another choice. And that this becomes incredibly important at these places where you have these vast cultural differences between the designers and the people who are making use of things. This should be familiar to you. I just sort of put it in the colonial context to say some of those differences are also historic, economic, and political differences that go way beyond what it is you're designing, and that's part of the context that you have to take into account. So I guess I'll stop there.
Thanks, Larisa. So we have a question for now.
Really quick one. You said at the beginning that it was about one record per 1,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a different statistic for another country that you could throw out?
No.
Okay.
Not off the top of my head, but you know, if you think of if you can think of the population of the U.S., I mean, it's nothing like that. I mean, I think maybe maybe the estimation of it is 3%. It was in like 90, I think it's 96. It was 3% of the global music industry. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's a better statistic, because again, 2.5 million people. There's a lot of people in the globe, so we're looking at a pretty sizable chunk. And again, those numbers have to be raw because nobody was counting very carefully a lot of this stuff. And influence is a hard thing. You know, I would also say as a DJ that like Jamaican music making practices have influenced far more musical cultures than they may not be actually represented in those cultures, but without Jamaican music practices, we wouldn't have hip hop, because Jamaicans were the folks that were chatting on the mic in front of turntables first. So, right, like that influence and that creativity and that reuse of technology that was meant to be read-only into a performance practice, that it's not the only place it came from, but that's one of the places that it came from. And I think the fact that these were marginalized places is part of the story. I think if you had easy access to the technology within the context for which it was originally designed, you might not have messed with the technology so much. But the farther it gets from its origins, the more likely these people are to reinterpret it, I think, in certain ways. So.
If music developed in such a community-like way, is it too simplistic to ask why they can't simply put a Creative Commons-like license over their music and say, go forth and be innovative and creative?
It's not, I mean, I think, it's a good question. I think it's not that it's completely communal in that people pursue individual fame and want their name as an individual to be known. And definitely people want to make money, you know. But I think it is true that the definition of certain, one, technical tweak that could work would be to redefine the kinds of licenses or the kinds of ownership that exist to recognize. In the same way that in the U.S. people are talking about, changing the derivative works right to allow mashups and remixes, right? It's a similar kind of thing. The problem with Creative Commons, I think, for some of these concerns is that in Jamaica and in a lot of places, it matters who wants to use it in a way that currently Creative Commons doesn't really account for. So you can say commercial versus non-commercial. Most Jamaicans that I met were pretty interested in being commercial, like they were. And so, but it is true that they might have felt different if it was Sony versus a small commercial company, or say a foreign company versus a local, right? The law isn't very good at making those kinds of distinctions, right? Those are like about other issues, So I think there are ways that could be approached in the law, but I also think if the law wasn't starting to be so intimate in like technology and people's lives or being forced into people's lives, it might be that a lot of this would sort itself out socially more interestingly. The problem is partly that it's being imported into all the technologies in ways that aren't being thought out very carefully, or that's not on people's radar, or maybe there's just not enough Jamaicans designing the technology, or I don't know what, But it's a good question. I mean, I think that's certainly from the lawyers, that's one thing they're very interested in, is how can we design an instrument that's going to reflect priorities. The issue of like how people relate to law more broadly is a whole other story. I mean, and the thing is, like, Jamaica has a lot of other problems around law that go way beyond copyright enforcement and may not be a priority. But limiting the reach of law into people's lives in itself, again, for me, keeping people outside might be a better option in a way than trying to sort of design the perfect way to pull them in. Just because of that, because I'm antsy about those risks. But it's a very good question.
I think we are going to wrap things up here. Thank you very much.
This is just my the grand digital future, right, or the grand technological future.